Hey everyone, so as we all know, one of the most interesting aspects of One Piece is the lore, with the Void Century and the ancient weapons and the ancient kingdom and all sorts of other puzzle pieces that are still being put together. But if we can consider all that to sort of be the large-scale ancient lore behind the series, then what I find just as interesting that's not actually talked about as much is the more modern-day lore of the history of pirates. Basically the lore of the actual pirate world. Because initially things seemed pretty straightforward, with there being small-time pirates, and then big-time pirates, and then a little after that we started to realize that, okay, there are a lot of actually up-and-coming pirates that are considered to be rookies that are going up against the sort of established pirates. And then beyond that, we began to realize that the established order of pirates also has a lot of nuance to it, with some pirates being part of an older guard, and now, especially in the last 100 chapters or so, we finally need to put the pieces together to get a complete history of what that older guard was actually like, and what came even before that older guard. And so at this point, putting it all together, I've come to realize that there are essentially 4 distinct eras of piracy in the One Piece world, and it's actually really interesting to see how these eras compare, the parallels between the eras, the events that mark the end of one era and the start of a new one, and so on. But before we get into all that, make sure to subscribe for regular One Piece content like this. So, across each era, or age, whatever you want to call it, I think there are clear patterns in terms of how a given age goes. The era tends to start with established figures already at the top, and then a sudden influx of new rising stars who are trying to push towards the top. You could say it always starts with what we'll call the established guard, versus the new supernovas of that given era. Over the course of the era, the supernovas get stronger, some rise up in the world, some drown, some replace members of the established order, and then after some period of time things kind of fall into place where a new hierarchy has been settled into. Then after that sort of stable, established status quo has set in, there tends to be a major defining event that clearly ends that era that also tends to coincide with the advent of a new batch of supernovas who are once again pushing towards the top and mixing up the status quo. Now, we obviously know that pirates have been a thing for a long time, as we know from, Brook and the Rumbar pirates, but it sounds like the first era of truly great pirates as a sort of military force in the world, similar to how all the Yonko are today, was in the Rocks era. And this was basically the genesis of great pirates as we know them today. And the reason I say that this era is a bit different is because everything was much more concentrated. This was long before, Roger died and gave his speech and sent everybody off to sea. During this time of Rocks, there was really only one truly great pirate, right? The established top dog. And that was Rocks himself. Because underneath him, he had lots of smaller pirates as his subordinates, and sure, they may have been great in their own right, but they were still his subordinates. And since it sounds like all notable pirates were just under his wing, there was also only really one supernova of this era, and that sounds like it was Roger. This era was the most straightforward. There was only one big boss established pirate, and one supernova who challenged him and took him down. And I said every era ends with one definitive incident, and that was, in this case, the Battle of God Valley. This battle was the end of Rocks in his era, and what's interesting is that it's been made clear that all of Rocks' greatest subordinates, like Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, etc., they were not yet in their primes. So when Roger defeated Rocks and basically put an end to Rocks' pirate supercrew, that basically meant that Roger was now the top dog of the seas. And this next era, for the 18 or so years after that, was essentially Roger's era. So following what I said, this new post-Rocks era starts with Roger as the greatest pirate, and all these other figures, Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, Shiki, and so on, they actually started this era essentially as supernovas on the rise. They had to start going out to create their own pirate crews, making their own territories and becoming stronger. We literally see Whitebeard's tiny crew grow into a fleet over the course of this era. We see Kaido turn Wano into his base of operations, and so on. So the era starts with Roger at the top, and all these rising stars as well. And as I said, over the course of the era, some are able to climb and get to the top themselves, others end up probably a few rungs lower on the ladder, and others just crash and burn. So, in terms of Roger's era, while no one ever really surpassed Roger as the greatest pirate of the era, we know that Whitebeard at the very least was the only one who became great enough that he and his crew were actually on par with Roger and his crew. And he is the only pirate who is now regularly mentioned in the same breath as Roger from these days. Kaido and Big Mom also became great pirates during this time, though not to the degree of Roger and Whitebeard. And then there were countless pirates who were crushed trying to challenge the likes of Roger and Whitebeard. We know, for example, that Shiki is one such famous pirate who tried to rise to the top during this era, but could not defeat Roger, and ultimately ended up in Impel Down. But Impel Down beyond that is actually filled with many pirates such as these, pirates who aimed for the top, but were defeated by Roger and or Whitebeard. And as I said, the era always ends with some great event, and in this case, it was Roger's execution. This was the definitive end of the previous era, the Roger era, and the start of the Great Age of Pirates, or the Great Pirate Era as we know it today, whatever you want to call it. If Rox's era was basically just a one-man show with the Rox pirates being the only major super crew until Roger's crew rose up and defeated them, then the Roger era was basically mostly composed of the remnants of the Rox pirates creating their own crews, rising up as the supernovas in the world, with Roger already as the established top dog. But then the Great Pirate Era was a total game changer, as suddenly there was a huge incentive for people across the world to drop everything and become pirates, because now the One Piece was such an attractive prospect. And so this was the time that pirating became sort of mainstream. Before, it was all concentrated around a small group of legendary pirates, basically former Rox crew members and Roger himself, whereas after Roger's execution, it was basically open season for everyone. So this new Great Pirate Era starts off with Whitebeard now as the new clear top dog, even if he doesn't care for that status officially, and Big Mom and Kaido as the other two great pirates who managed to establish themselves during Roger's era, as far as we know of. The way that Sengoku talks about the great pirates of Rox's crew, it does sound like Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, and Shiki were the biggest names to come out of the Rox's crew anyway, and of course Shiki fell off, so bottom line, that leaves Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom, the major supernovas of the previous era who became strong and rose to the top, basically start the next era, the Great Pirate Era, as the established strongest at the top of the ladder. So again, at Roger's execution, we are closing out his era and starting a new era with the strongest established at the top already, and as I also said, the end of an era and the start of a new one also tends to coincide with a new wave of up-and-coming supernovas, and that's exactly what we see here. All these characters gathered at Roger's execution were essentially the worst generation of that Great Pirate Era. They were the pirates that grew to become big names during this era. They were the supernovas of this era. Shanks was just starting out on his own, Doflamingo was just 17 at this time, Crocodile was just 17 at this time, etc. After this execution, so many of these characters set out to try and become Pirate King themselves, and over the course of the next 20 years, this Great Pirate Era, we again go through this sort of cycle, where some of these up-and-comers rise to the top, some end up a few rungs short, and then others just drown. Obviously, Oda's not going to spend a lot of time highlighting the countless failed pirates of this era, but some of the more notable ones are likely, the level 6 prisoners of Impel Down, as well as, we know some figures like Fisher Tiger, for example, who became somewhat infamous but was ultimately hunted down. Similarly, you could call Moria and Crocodile failures, as they both tried to fight against the established top dogs, Kaido and Whitebeard respectively, and got crushed and sent back to paradise, though they at least got to survive and, live on as warlords. Doflamingo, for example, sounds like he never got crushed exactly, and he actually became a great pirate during this era, and although there was ultimately a huge gap between him and the four emperors, he still ultimately carried a lot of weight in the New World. And surprisingly, even though this was the Great Age of Pirates, the Great Pirate Era, with an unprecedentedly huge wave of new pirates hitting the scene, what's interesting is that out of all these pirates, only Shanks actually made it to the top here. Only Shanks joined Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom as the new sort of established order, the new top dogs of the pirate world. So as much as this was hyped up as the Great Age of Pirates, the status quo at the top actually didn't change that much over the course of this era, except for one really significant way at the end. Because again, the era has to close with a great event, and in this case, it was of course the Battle of Marineford. This was the greatest battle of this era of the Great Age of Pirates, and Oda made it very, very clear that this was the close of the era, and it ended with the greatest pirate of that era, Whitebeard, dying. Similarly, it coincided perfectly with the rise of the new wave of supernovas, the characters we know as, the modern-day worst generation, Luffy, Kid, Law, Blackbeard, and so on, all of them hitting the New World just as the era came to a close, and with Blackbeard being the one to actually kill Whitebeard and actually stake his claim on the next era being his. And that's really interesting, that we are actually no longer in the Great Age of Pirates. What we have now is what characters have been calling for a long time, the New Age, and this is the era where the climax of the story is going to take place. And once again, we are poised to go through this cycle, where we are starting this new era with an established order, established top dogs, and now the supernovas of this new era are going to attempt to rise up and shake up this status quo. It's just all obviously going to happen a lot faster here for the sake of storytelling. It's not like there's going to be another 20-year span of seeing these supernovas slowly try to take down the old generation. But the bottom line is, there's just a very well thought out flow to the cycle of pirates in the One Piece verse, spanning across 40 years. Because there was, a time that Whitebeard would just talk about the old days, and that was like a vague concept of, I'm sure it was, Whitebeard and Roger and some other guys. But now we actually know the cycles that things happen in. And we even know what cycle Whitebeard is from. We know the era in which Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom were the up-and-comers was in Roger's era. We know that the era that Shanks, Doflamingo, Crocodile, Moria, and so on, the era they came up in was the Great Pirate Era. And now we can see that Luffy, Law, Kid, Blackbeard, and the rest are attempting to come up in this era, the New Age. And we can see how figures stick around or fall off from era to era. And we can see that the three great events that marked the openings and closings of different eras was first the God Valley incident, which ended Rox's era and started Roger's era, then Roger's execution, which ended Roger's era and started the Great Pirate Era, and then finally the Battle of Marineford, which ended the Great Age of Pirates and started the New Age. Each time the greatest pirate of the existing era would die, with Rox dying in God Valley, Roger dying in his execution obviously, and Whitebeard dying at Marineford. And each time the figures who would rise up in the next era were present, with obviously Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom present for Rox's fall, Shanks, Doflamingo, Crocodile, and so on being present for Roger's death, and all the supernova of today watching over the Battle of Marineford. Now lastly, just for fun, I kind of want to compare eras, because we've gotten the sense over the years that lots of characters speak somewhat dismissively of the newer generation, and arguably even Shanks' generation. And honestly, the more we've learned about pirate history, the more that makes sense. Because Roger's era had by far the greatest pirates, with Roger in his prime, Whitebeard reaching his prime, and Kaido and Big Mom also probably getting pretty close to their primes. Not to mention before that we had Rox, who sounds at least comparable to Roger and Whitebeard, maybe even greater, we don't exactly know. So at first glance, looking at the so-called Great Age of Pirates, the pirates from this era don't actually seem to hold a candle to the old school pirates, with only Shanks becoming an emperor among this class. So at first glance, it seems like the Great Age of Pirates was actually more so about a higher quantity of pirates hitting the seas than quality, and that seems somewhat true, as there seems to be only one truly great pirate to have come out of this era, right? Shanks. However, if we look a little closer, things could easily have been a lot different because there are actually two other characters from this era that could also easily have been great pirates if they had so chosen, because at Roger's execution we can also see Dragon and Mihawk. Today, Dragon is the most wanted man in the world, likely one of the strongest characters in the world, and his revolutionary army operation seems like it may even be comparable to Yonko Cruz, though we still need to see more from them. Dragon just isn't classified as a pirate because he's actually more extreme in his goals. But it's clear that as a member of the worst generation of the Great Pirate Era, he could easily have risen to be an Emperor of the Sea if he so chose. He just took an even more hardcore route than being a pirate. And beyond Dragon, we of course have Mihawk, who was a pirate, but could probably have been a much greater pirate, arguably even an Emperor depending on your viewpoint on him, if Mihawk cared about anything besides swordsmanship. But as it is, Mihawk never cared about making a crew for himself, never cared about getting his own territory, and just generally he was fine settling for the easy life as a warlord so long as he could go around fighting people whenever he felt like it. So right there, this version of the worst generation, this version of, this era's supernovas, they could actually have had 3 pirate emperors come out of it, but ultimately it was just Shanks because, Dragon's goals went beyond being a pirate, and Mihawk just generally didn't care. So all that being said, how does this newest generation then stack up? The group that we know of as the worst generation? Well, what's interesting to me is that obviously this generation got a lot of hype initially with, plenty of characters talking about what a big deal this new group of pirates were, how they're making big waves in the New World, etc. However, if we look back at pirates' history, it's clear that this sort of thing has happened before, always around the time of a changing of an era. And this new batch of supernovas is just the newest version of it. Like, we haven't spent a lot of time getting flashbacks of the old days, but I wonder if this generation's hype is equal to how the world viewed the remnants of the Rocks pirates once they started to build their reputation. I wonder how it compares to how Shanks' generation was viewed when they started to come up. Obviously, with our new generation, you have plenty of characters dismissing them because they're new, and then plenty of characters really hyping them up. Now, obviously we know Luffy is going to go down as the greatest pirate of all time at the end of the day, but I do wonder what Blackbeard and Kid are going to look like by the end of the story. Like, I personally don't think Law is going to survive till the end, and I have a tough time seeing these other supernovas becoming, Emperor caliber pirates in the time frame of the story. But Blackbeard is already being written as, potentially the next coming of Rocks, and Kid hopefully will continue to gain strength and influence at least comparable to Luffy as the story progresses. But ultimately, is this era of pirates as a whole going to look comparable to Roger's era, where it was, Roger, Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, and so on? I don't know. It's interesting to think about how everything will fall into place by the end of the story, and what the pirate world will generally look like once the One Piece has been found. So if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon for extended thoughts on this and all future content. Link in the description below.